Hi, and welcome back into the We Shall Not Sleep podcast. Thank you for taking the time to check us out once again. This week, I had the privilege of speaking with one of my favorite people on the planet, Dr. Mark Frisius. He is a professor of church history and theology at Olivet Nazarene University. His book, which is pretty lengthily titled, and I quote, Tertullian's use of the pastoral epistles, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude, was published by Peter Lang Press in 2010. Before his tenure at Olivet, he was an adjunct professor at Marymount University and at the Catholic University of America. He is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the North American Patristic Society. Now, more importantly for this podcast's sake, he was my favorite professor at college, and I considered him to be a great friend. You are in for a treat this week, and we discuss matters of church history, theology, and how we can connect them to the church today. So, without any further ado, here is Dr. Mark Frisius. Well, this is a treat for me because at this point, people have heard about you in my life, who I talk to incessantly. You are absolutely my favorite professor, and I have no shame in admitting that I had favorites at school. Just like professors, I know you had favorite students. I probably wasn't one of them, but the one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this podcast is because you happen to teach a subject that is so imperative, I think, for the church. And unfortunately, unless you go to university or you do like some pointed research yourself, you're not really going to find a lot of the information freely out there being taught in Sunday school or even mentioned in some sermons, because it's so niche. And for me, like that fourth century of Christianity, that had to deal with Constantine and the legalization and 315 and all the way up through the First Council of Nicaea. Like that is like my favorite time period. Surprise, surprise, that's not a lot of people out there. So I brought you in to help maybe guide us a little bit about the importance of church history and what are some things we can learn from it. But I guess for those who don't know you, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit of how you came to know Christ and the church, or were you born in the church at all? Like, what is that journey like for you?
Sure. So I grew up in a church out near Portland, Oregon, and so my parents were always in church. So I think we probably were there more than the pastor most of the time. So I can remember, kind of making a faith commitment when I was maybe 5 or 6, and we kind of we went to children's church and did all of that sort of thing. And it really wasn't probably until high school, I imagine, that I kind of started to take my faith a little bit more seriously. But it wasn't really kind of ready, I guess, maybe to kind of commit fully to everything. And so it probably wasn't really until college that I really sort of surrendered. So when I started college, I was a chemical engineering major at the University of Washington. And
Right.
I was pulp and paper science major, so I made my own paper. But I hated chemistry, and that was a pretty sure sign I'm in the wrong major.
Yeah.
And I'd known for a while that I'd been called to the ministry, but for a long time I thought that ministry had to be a pastor, and I am not equipped to be a pastor. That's just not who I am. And it wasn't until I was in college at George Fox as a biblical studies major that I really kind of discovered a couple of things. The first was that, teaching is an incredible opportunity and an incredible ministry. As I kind of think about, the responsibility of helping to shape the next generation and imparting knowledge. And when I think of knowledge, I don't just think, kind of facts, but I think of how do we interpret and understand things? How do we contextualize things? And how do we put them to use? So So that was one thing that I started to see. And the second thing that I started to see was that was when I first met church history. Um, and I pointedly remember two things. One, so for those who are listening who never met me, my area specialty is early Christianity. Um, and so my first class on early Christianity, I hated it. I thought it was the dullest, driest subject on the planet. I hated going to that class. There was just nothing about it that sparked my interest. Um, and and then I had to take two classes in it. So the second class was on kind of the Reformation, everything after it. And the man who taught that, Dr. Irv Brenlinger, um, was incredible, um, and really awakened in me a distinct interest and passion for church history. Um, his main area of specialty was British church history around the time of William Wilberforce. So
Okay.
um, with the movement away from slavery in England, so I
Sure.
wasn't interested at all in his time period. And that was what really kind of sparked me to go back and look at some of the early stuff and discover just so much vibrancy and power, and incredible people who lived then, who really helped to shape the way in which the church developed and thought. And I started thinking, well, how does that kind of impact? This was back in the late '90s, but
Right.
how does that impact the church? Um, and then the second thing that hit me was, why hadn't I ever heard any of this before?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
so I've grown up in the church. The other thing I distinctly remember, I went home for spring break, and one of the assignments was we had to interview one of our pastors. Now, this was for another class that I was taking, and I sat down with the pastor and talked with him about kind of our church's polity for a bit. And then on the way out, he was asking how classes were going, and I said, they're going really well. And I learned about this John Wesley guy,
Oh, yeah.
the founder of Methodism and the Church of the Nazarene. And I started just talking about just how fascinating this Wesley guy is and how much I was really kind of in sync with his ideas. And I heard the pastor look at me and he said, we're Wesleyan, right? And I said, no, I actually didn't. I had no idea. I'd never heard of him. I had no idea that was kind of the denominational position of my church. And that kind of, still kind of, connects with me to say, and Michael, I know you kind of want to kind of at some point kind of talk about, how do we kind of church history in the modern church and what does it kind of look like? And that was really kind of got me thinking about that, was to say, well, I haven't heard about this. And I spent like every waking minute on a Sunday and on a Wednesday in this place. And it took going to college and taking ministry classes to actually hear about this. Um, you know, is anybody, kind of ever going to learn about this?
That's such a fascinating a way of putting it, because for me, I have the same, very very much the same a story. Not It wasn't until I got to school where I took just Christian theology, just the very intro, which sadly I didn't have you for, but I I was awakened to this idea that there was just bigger world behind Christianity, and I had grown up in the church, and I have a uncle who was a Lutheran minister, so I've even been a part of some of the more liturgical services growing up, and the why was always explained to me in that tradition. But as far as Wesleyan Arminianism and this guy named John Wesley, like you said, but what about how we even got our New Testament? So when I got to History of Christianity 1 with you, and you started mentioning these people like Ambrose, Theodosius, Constantine, who I've heard of before, but I don't know what context. It just opened my world to something greater, and having our paths, converge at Olivet. One of the questions I had is that you had a wide history of where you went to school. You didn't just stay in a Wesleyan university. I mean, you traveled around, you went to George Fox, then you went to Asbury, then you made your way to Catholic University of America. It seems to me like it's a diverse background. So how did you trace your way from your undergrad to going and getting your master's of divinity, and then finally onto your doctoral work?
Yeah. So in undergrad, I was looking at, when I was graduating, I was looking at a couple of different things. Um, so I was thinking of going to teach English in China. Um, and that ended up not working out. And then at the very last minute, I said, well, I guess I probably ought to go to seminary. And the professor who really kind of encouraged me in my academic development had gone to Asbury and had spoken very highly of it. And I thought, well, it's good enough for him. It's good enough for me. And so there I did my master's in divinity. So George Fox is a Quaker school. So George Fox is the founder of Quakerism. But Quakerism today, the Friends Church is another term for it, is fairly theologically Wesleyan. So I, kind of had some adherence to Wesleyanism there. And Asbury is a part of the Methodist tradition. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not officially a part of the United Methodist Church, but a lot of United Methodist pastors go there. And there really, I had a couple of really good professors who were specialists in Reformation era. I discovered there weren't a lot of Protestants overall who did much work in ancient Christianity. And beyond that, not many Wesleyans. A lot of Lutherans will do that. And part of this Lutheran tradition is more tied into kind of the past. Luther never saw the Reformation as a break from tradition, rather as a break from the Roman Catholic understanding of tradition. Mm-hmm. And some Episcopalians believe the same way, Anglicans, but not a lot of Wesleyans kind of work in that area. So when it came time to go on to doing second masters, there weren't really many Protestant schools that were doing anything in early Christianity, and particularly from a position of those who appreciate the tradition. Mm-hmm. The way that I see it oftentimes in kind of scholarly circles is that many will approach it from more of an academic perspective and don't necessarily see it as formative to faith. And so I wanted to go to a school that would have a good academic tradition, but would also see it as, how does this shape and form us? Instead of just, what did they say? Why did they say it? What are they arguing against? I want to say, how does it kind of impact today? And so that's a pretty significant piece of the Roman Catholic tradition. And so Catholic University of America had a couple of really top-notch scholars who were leaders in early Christian thought. And so that was the place that ended up being really good for me.
Yeah, and then you eventually would make your way to Olivet, where I would run into you, and it was funny is because I actually started taking the classes with you a year ahead of time. I heard great things about you, and I was following one of my upperclassmen friends through their theological track, and I realized that I didn't have to be a junior to take history of Christianity. There wasn't a prerequisite other than Theo 101. So that's why I got into it. Now, one of the things that immediately struck me was the fact that you use such a way of storytelling. I will say, I'm not going to name who, but the way you taught history of Christianity, one, with injecting a lot of humor and relatability to these characters of history, was what kept me awake and kept me interested. Can't say that for all of my classes with church history, but when it comes to this area, you mentioned this formative training. It's not just something that is strictly academic. What was it to you, like when you graduated, you have your doctorate, this is what you want to do? It's just as far as selling a history of Christianity, or if you were to propose or be in head of a department, what is the selling point for church history that adds to the formative nature of it? The wild card, I guess, if you will, that transcends the academic. Why do you want kids to study this who are a part of the church?
Yeah, I think one of the weaknesses of our kind of current culture, um, it's often called the tyranny of the immediacy. That everything is a short soundbite. Everything has to be decided in the here and the now. And there's not always a lot of time for reflection or contextualization. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that that's one of the things that history broadly kind of defined, and then within a Christian environment, church history helps us to get past a little bit, or to at least um, navigate a little bit better. Um, that it tells us a couple of things. One, I'm probably not the first person who's thought this, and then asks the
Yeah.
question, why did they think something similar? What were the reactions to it? What are the battles that have been fought? Um, like part of me thinks, the early church was a wild place. Um,
Hmm.
there were people everywhere doing all kinds of stuff, but there were certain things that um, they were able to hone in on and say, this is what is distinctive to our community. And the creeds are a good example of that. This is what is distinctive to our thought.
Sure.
And then I think that the same thing happened with the practice of the church. One of the things that many early scholars of early history will tell us, early church history will tell us, is that the early church was at least a fairly multicultural place. So one of the often misnomers of the Roman Empire is like it was this kind of monolithic whole kind of thing,
Hmm.
where everybody's kind of thinking the same thing because Caesar told you to. Well, it's fun for like a Ridley Scott movie or something, but it's not reality at all. Um, that Rome was kind of a hodgepodge, really, of dozens and dozens of cultures. That, yeah, you all were Roman together, but you also maintain lots of different aspects of your identity. And there wasn't a lot of kind of cross pollination that went on oftentimes. And Christianity becomes one of the many, or one of the few, I think, that kind of went out into other people groups within the Roman Empire, even outside of the Roman Empire into the Persian Empire, um, and started evangelizing. And it was very rare in that day for anybody to, kind of switch religions. If you got polytheism going on, last thing you wanted to do is make the other gods angry because you stole their worshippers. So it does kind of make Christianity somewhat unique in that era, just in terms of how they practiced. But you started to have this environment that started to happen where people from all the different cultures in a city and all the different walks of life in the Roman Empire, rich, poor, people from different tribal groups were all kind of coming together. And we see a lot of the struggle when we read in the early church, like how do we, kind of get that together?
Sure.
How do we kind of get rid of, your status as a slave, or you're a rich guy, or you're the poor, or you're a native North African, or you're an Italian. Like how do we kind of forge a church out of all of that? They did a lot of the hard work to say, how can we exist together in this without kind of our differences kind of ripping us apart?
Wow. What a novel question to ask, especially with today. You're touching on something that I have felt ever since I started learning about this. Was seeing a lot of parallels between the fourth century specifically. I know you're not referring just to the fourth century, but the area of interest that caught my eye the most, and today with a lot of like rulers, politicization of Christianity, the pulls in different directions as far as like what do we deem as theologically correct and what is heresy. And I'm continuing to see that, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But what you were just describing, that kind of this multiculturalism that is funny, is I just got done interviewing one of my first guests, and he grew up at Times Square Church, and I would say he attended there for 2 years, and there were 103 nationalities
Hmm.
represented in that congregation at one point in time in the early 2000s. And that is something that he said it was probably the closest thing to heaven he's ever experienced. But you bring up a great point that Christianity was trying to transcend that, and one of the only ones successfully doing it. And I'm just wondering, do you see a parallel today in that aspect, and the same charge that we have as Americans, also as Christians first?
Yeah, I think in the, prior to Constantine, you see a lot more movements to say, how do we live in an egalitarian environment? How do we create one of those in our church community? And their thought wasn't necessarily that the government is the one that does it for us. I mean, when you're an illegal religion, you probably don't want to count on the government to do much for you. Right. So they had to kind of, navigate some of that and say, all right. And you can even see it in the New Testament writings. Like I particularly think of the book of James, where James just kind of reams them out for giving preferential treatment to the rich. And he does it multiple times throughout his somewhat sporadic letter. And you can see kind of developing later on where you have all kinds of divides that they're trying to heal. So I think of a letter that we know as First Clement, written by Clement of Rome, probably sometime around the turn of the second century, so late 90s, early 100s. And there's this group in Corinth, two groups, and one group is made of young folks that want to kind of jump into leadership, and there's the old ones who don't want to let them.
Right.
And there's all kinds of disputes about how do we use the funding that we have, how do we use our spiritual gifts, some of those things. And you can see them trying to kind of figure that way forward. So some of the ways they did that was really kind of through a radical sense of caring for the poor. Now, there was always disagreement about how do we kind of best do that.
Sure.
But you don't find somebody coming and saying, that care for the poor is like some radical idea, and someone like that. And for the most part, they viewed it as, and here's, I think, another piece that is difficult for folks in kind of the current world to kind of wrap their minds around. They viewed it as both the individual responsibility and corporate responsibility. And they oftentimes saw it as not as a microcosm, but as existing on a local level. And so by that, what I mean is that they could have seen, the epidemic of slavery in the Roman world and been really kind of disheartened, or the epidemic of poverty, and said, there's just poverty everywhere, it's in every city, there's hundreds of thousands of the poor, and that's not super overwhelming, right? But what the tack they took was to say, well, there's also a poor person that I walk by on my way to work. There's something I can do for that guy, or for that gal. And so they took it, and you can oftentimes find in their sermons the encouragement. And here, John Chrysostom is a pretty good example, a late 4th century bishop of Constantinople, who basically talks about and says, look, the care for the poor is not just the church, it's you. And so, like, I oftentimes think like what they had going on and what John is responding to was almost like the I gave it the office mentality, which I don't even know if that's a phrase anymore. But I gave it to some charitable thing at the office, so I don't have to take a personal stake in it.
Sure, that makes complete sense.
And they saw it and said, we've all got a personal stake. That for the most part, most people in the early church are fairly poor themselves. And part of what they would say is, you can help that one person. You don't need the second sandwich. Maybe you could give, half Jimmy John's to somebody there, and you'll be okay. And they did the same thing with adoption. Adoption they saw as kind of a personalized response, and as an individual responsibility in the community. Because in part they thought, well, it's one more mouth that will eventually kind of grow up and leave the house.
Right.
So, and then they also saw other things as kind of a communal responsibility. So, The care for the widow is usually seen as a communal responsibility. But they started to set up systems to say, all right, how do we make sure that we don't kind of let people or allow people to kind of escape our notice?
Well,
one of the very first.
That I'll just say real quick, that is so convicting for today, especially in our country. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. You can continue. It's just that hits a lot different, knowing their position, their lack of status, lack of resources, but their commitment is astonishing.
And we find them talking about that in their apologies. So when they kind of, or their defenses of the faith, when they would write to emperors who were persecuting them, that's what they talk about. And they're like, this is what we do. It's not like we're off having wild parties and joining orgies. But no, we care for the poor. We go out and we take abandoned widows who have no choice for the most part except to go to prostitution to feed themselves, and we take care of them. Mm-hmm. And if we look in kind of the after Constantine era, you have an attempt to kind of restore what's vaguely called Roman paganism to the empire. And this is done by Emperor Julian. History oftentimes remembers him as Julian the Apostate. And he tries to kind of restore paganism to kind of an ascendant place in the empire. And you can read his works, and he talks about, he calls the Christians the Galileans. And he wants basically, he thinks the whole reason that Christianity was so successful is because they care for the poor. And he basically goes after the Roman priests and says, we need to do the same thing. Like, we lost this somewhere. And part of what I think the early church kind of hit on was there's certainly a time for kind of talking about how do we do it and what's the best approach and that sort of thing. But there also has to be the time where we say, we also have to be in action. And that it has to start with me. That it can't be, well, the government needs better policies or the church needs to establish another food bank. It's me. I've got to do it. And again, it's oftentimes very difficult because we see kind of the enormity of the problem because we're in such a social media driven world. And where you've got kind of everybody with a smartphone is, showing pictures and that sort of thing. And so I think it oftentimes makes that kind of, overwhelming. And yeah.
I was thinking that when you start talking about like the post-Constantine era, like having like that particular era is so fascinating. And I know I had other questions for you, but since we're right there, can you just briefly, for those who don't know who Constantine is, I know that history is still divided, and I know that's something we couldn't even come to a conclusion of whether or not like Constantine was actually considered Orthodox, or if he was actually I'll say, put it this way, he didn't really know what he believed when it came to the person of Jesus, and there were two sides pulling him, and it seemed like even though he believed he received a vision from God and legalized Christianity, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misremembering, but the jury's still out on what Constantine, like his true motives were, right? So you have a guy who ends up usurping the throne, legalizing Christianity, and really pushes Christianity into a new era. But can you talk maybe what the significance of Constantine and that particular legalization meant?
Yeah, that's you might need more than an hour. Yeah.
Right. I know.
So Constantine the Great is probably one of the most divisive figures in church history. And oftentimes I'll talk about how there are certain game changers. I'm a basketball fan, and I'm near Chicago. Michael Jordan's one of those guys, right? He changed basketball. LeBron, I think, is probably going to go down the same way that you talk about before him and after him. And historically, there are a number of folks who are that way, but in the history of the church, perhaps outside of some people like Luther, the Apostle Paul, and St. Augustine, Constantine's in that discussion. And what makes him unique, and for the sake of history, we're not talking about Jesus here, so sure. Jesus certainly changes the game. But Constantine is unique because he's a political person rather than a theologian. So Constantine comes to power in the Roman Empire in the early 300s. So in his day, the empire had split into four pieces that were joined together, but ruled separately. So his dad, Constantius, was the emperor of basically France and part of the British Isles, at least the part that they had conquered by that point. So you can see some of the wonderful Hollywood masterpieces on Hadrian's Wall. Like I think Channing Tatum made one. I'm not recommending that one, for the record. But eventually Constantine discovers his dad has died, and he goes out to kind of see to kind of the arrangements for his father, and then takes over for his dad as the emperor of what the Romans called the Far West. And he believes that he has a divine mandate to restore a single rule to the Roman Empire. And at least according to a man named Caesarea, who was our first church historian, and one of the biographers of Constantine. Constantine doesn't quite know which God has called him to this. And that's where the debate starts. Did Constantine and his family, were they traditional Romans who believed in lots of gods? Were they more crusted Romans who believed in just one God? Probably the conquered son, the sole Invictus. And he'd come into contact with Christians. He knew who the Christians were. For the most part, when he comes to power initially, there was persecution going on. We call it the Great Persecution, inaugurated by Diocletian, yes. and carried on by Galerius. So that's still active. So Constantine never really persecuted Christians at any kind of scale. May have put a few to death just to kind of save face with the more senior Emperor Galerius. But he certainly knew Christians. So it's part of his manifest destiny then to kind of go and take over the empire. He heads on down to the city of Rome. And it's a long trip. And it starts to lose the element of surprise. Starts to lose soldiers. He's, fresh out of cash. He's running out of supplies. And he has to try to take the city of Rome, which is a tall task. Rome's got the walls. The soldiers there are arrested. And, all that the Roman emperor, a guy named Maxentius, has to do, or the emperor in Rome has to do, is just stay put, pretty much to win. Right. From a tactical standpoint. So Constantine's got no basis for winning this battle. But he believes again that some deity has called him to this mission. And so he spends some time praying, and then he has this very well-known vision where he sees the symbol of Christ, of the cross, up in the heavens. And he's told, in hoc victo, by this sign he will conquer. And he'll later on have another vision as well. And so he ends up placing Christian symbols on the soldiers' shields. They take up the standard of the cross as the standard of the army, and then they go to battle. And it's very clear, there's very clear Christian symbols. He puts the very famous Chi-Rho, which is the first two Greek letters of the name Christ, on the shields of his soldiers. And they storm the city, or at least they're on their way to storm the city. And Maxentius the emperor actually rides out and meets them. Which, again, from a tactical standpoint, is not the dumbest thing you could do. You've got the Tiber River that you got to cross. So you got to bridges or choke points. You can't bring the full kind of weight of your army to bear going across a bridge. And so Maxentius ends up, in one way or another, falling into a Tiber River and drowning, at least as best we can tell. And that pretty much just ends the battle. And for kind of really all purposes, Constantine takes the city of Rome without much fight. And gets all the stuff that Maxentius has been storing there. And that's really kind of the point where most are going to identify the conversion of Constantine. One of his first acts then, so that's in the year 312. In 313, then he signs, along with his brother-in-law Licinius, who ruled in the eastern half of the empire, the Edict of Milan, which for the first time announces that Christianity is now a legal religion. It's not the state religion yet. That's not until the 380s with Emperor Theodosius I. But it's a legal religion, and it's the religion that the brand new, very, very popular emperor is an adherent to. And that creates a titanic shift within Christianity. That you go from being a persecuted minority to being a religion of those in power.
Yeah, and it happened pretty much that quick. There was not a transitionary period. There wasn't a trial phase or a cooling off phase, or hey, we'll get our money back at the end of this trial if it doesn't work out. I mean, it is immediate, and for good. We were able to we had a lot of stuff going on. I mean, we were fighting because we didn't know that there were people bringing up charges of, was Jesus really God? I mean, or was he just a special human, or was he even human at all? So we're dealing with, the first generations whose ancestors never saw Christ. So now it's really being challenged, saying, well, what are we going to be? So you have like this identity crisis, but then they're being persecuted. So you kind of have to put that on the back burner. Your goal is to survive and preserve the texts, the sacred texts that are being turned over by apostates left and right. And then you're legalized, and now you're not under the fear of persecution. So what does the church do? One, you can coalesce your resources, but immediately, like, those heresies, like, they don't go away. They had to meet and have, like you mentioned, the importance of the creeds earlier. We had to really establish who we were, and that was taking a look inward first, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, that's just through my reading of history there.
Yeah, it creates a whole host of difficulties. One of the questions at the end of persecution is, so what do we do with the people who they call them the last?
Sure.
So those who had renounced the faith in one way or another, but now that we're legal again, want to come back. What do we do with that? A second question would be, so what are the entrance requirements? That people were lining up at the church doors to want to join. And so is there any kind of, there used to be a vetting process? It used to take up to 3 years of training to be baptized in the church. What do we do with it?
Sure.
Becomes a very question. And Constantine starts all kinds of massive building projects, and is almost always attended. And that creates an environment where folks are oftentimes called like new money folks. So people who their family has just come to wealth, and oftentimes their wealth is a little more dependent on the goodwill of the government. So if you're kind of the old money kind of folks who had property, and your great times 20 grandparents were all senators, you didn't have to worry about the winds of change with the emperor. They come and go. We're wealthy. But the new folks, man, you need the government contracts, all those sorts of things in order to keep the money that you've become quite used to. And so the last thing you want to do is, not have any face time with the emperor. So you show up to church too. And so it starts to raise the question of, okay, so not all this wealth coming in. Not only what we do with it, but how is it kind of changing the face of Christianity? And it also starts to change the way in which kind of dialogue takes place. So do we have to listen to governors? That, a governor is not going to be terribly pleased if there's a bishop in his community that is telling them to do something that he doesn't want to do. And it starts to become the question of, well, who controls people and who ultimately leads the church. And when you kind of spell that out for history, especially when you get from the Middle Ages, that's a dynamic question. That as the church kind of accrues more and more political power, what the church wanted to do was to really use the government to basically be an evangelistic tool. That's why you get eventually where conquer a new people group, you force them to convert. You start to get that sort of dynamic where the government is what's actually in charge of pushing Christianity forward. And it becomes, just broadly speaking, kind of an easy way out. That, everybody's Christian now.
Mm-hmm.
And, granted, they don't have a clue what Christianity is, but hey, they got that. And because they're now citizens of this country, they are Christians and they're Christians. And it creates the sense that our national identity and our religious identity are the same thing. And I think kind of that gets going at the time of Constantine, and it just continues to spiral because, in part, the bishops start to get a lot more authority in their communities. They become recognized people in their communities. But to the same sense, the government wants to control the church. I mean, if you think about it, one of the messages of most major religions is, how do we attain to the afterlife? What do we got to do here in order to have a better there? And again, broadly speaking, Christianity is within that vein. What do I have to do here? Who do I have to be in order to assure that I go to heaven? Mm-hmm. And when you are talking about someone's soul and the well-being of their soul and of their entire existence, their whole being, the one who speaks to that has tremendous authority. Because pastors and bishops and religious leaders, they're out to care of the soul, both in terms of spiritual disciplines, theology, all of those sorts of things. And if you think about it from kind of a governmental point of view, well, what better way to control people? Perhaps sounding, almost a little, was it Stalin? Called religion the opiate of the people. I can't remember now. Yeah. I think it was him, but don't quote me on it. But there's a tremendous amount, I just kind of think broadly, that religion has incredible control over people. And if you're an authoritarian government, man, that's a pretty good tool. Yes. And that's why we see so much kind of vying between the church and the state, kind of historically, of who's in charge. Who's got kind of the last say on stuff. And really with the advent of Constantine, that becomes a major controlling factor. At the same point, if you're a bishop, you probably got to be very careful about mouthing off about the sitting emperor because he doesn't have a sword. Right. He's got a lot of practice using it. And it creates kind of this tension, I think, between the church and the state, even in the time of Constantine. And probably one of the best examples of that is going to be what we know as the Council of Nicaea. And Michael, you were kind of referencing it vaguely beforehand.
You're beating me to the punch, absolutely.
I get the feeling you're wanting me to eventually get there. When Constantine, when we last left him, had taken over Rome, but he wants the whole enchilada kind of thing, right? He wants to take over the entire empire, which means he's got to go fight his brother-in-law in the east at some point in time. So that happens in 324. He soundly beats his brother-in-law. Actually puts him in prison and then executes him later. Probably made for some awkward family gatherings. But when he arrives in the east, one of the foremost questions on his mind. So he's taken over half of an empire. Who used to, lead it to someone else. And they probably bad mouthing him over there for a while. Now he's in charge of them, and the question is, how do I kind of unite everybody kind of back together again, right? How do I kind of, win the hearts and minds of people here? So he's looking for kind of tools to unify, and you can see that historically. Anytime kind of somebody conquers another territory, That's the big question. I don't want to conquer you and kind of have to keep my eye on you. I want you to feel like you're a part of this bigger empire, and then we move forward together. This is why Alexander the Great is doing Hellenism stuff. I want you all to buy in the fact, hey, we're all Greeks together, even though you're not Greek, right? The Romans did the same thing. I want you to buy, we're Romans together, and we were better Romans than you were still Roman. And Constantine's looking for, how do I do that? How do I do that? Because, in the West, they read then they're speaking Latin, in the East, Greek. So language couldn't be it. So what is it? And he's like, well, Christianity can really work well here. Christianity was already in kind of all the cities. They had a whole communication network. They had a whole structure and hierarchy set up. They were used to talking to each other. It was a really nice kind of system if you're Constantine, you're looking at it and saying, this could really help me to unite the whole empire together again. And then he's got the problem. In the East, the church is not united because of a dispute that we know as the Arian dispute, named after a early 4th century presbyter named Arius. Can't easy to remember who he named after. And he basically, just in a nutshell, just said, Jesus is a creature. He's not God. So he's not us either. He's better than humans. He's the pinnacle of creation. He's the first of all creation. But for the Arians, we believe that he is a creature. He is not divine. So they would even they'd have slogans like and I always think, like, you see a lot of kind of the different marches that we're seeing lately, a lot of kind of slogans being held up on signs. And they did the same thing. Sure. It's fascinating. So they would stand on different street corners yelling at each other. Their kind of catchphrases. And so the Arian catchphrase was, there was a time when he was not. And the respondents, there was not a time when he was not. They always tell you don't do double negatives, but it works if you're yelling slogans, I guess. And so, but this was a major just because it's asking the question of who was Jesus. Is Jesus truly God or is he not? And it touches all kinds of things. Primarily, it asks the question of, well, what's salvation? How are we saved? And who do we pray to?
I'm glad they touched upon the superficial questions of the day. So you have, what you see is there's a problem. He has an information network, if you will. He has a method of doing it, but there's some fracturing there. So leveraging his control, he wants to, again, coalesce things together for his own benefit, using Christianity and to do it. And helping us too. I mean, it wasn't helpful to get a firm answer on who Jesus was. So how exactly did Constantine play a role in orchestrating Nicaea?
So I tend to be fairly sympathetic to Constantine. I remember when I first met him, I hated him. I thought he was horrible, and there are usually a couple schools of thought, like Constantine ruined Christianity. And you see that a lot today, even, that you'll see movements in many kind of denominations. Let's go back to ancient Christianity before kind of the advent of what we call imperial Christianity, which is basically Constantine. And so at first I was very negative towards it, like, man, you ruined the purity of the early church. And then, as I looked at him more, I became a little more sympathetic, and started to see, like, man, the questions that he was dealing with are incredibly complex, and ones that we haven't solved today. If just a cursory look at my own Facebook feed will tell me that the response to President Trump throughout the last 4 years has been very different amongst Christian Christians, with especially thoughts on Christian nationalism. In fact, I don't know if the date we would record these, but the riot at the Capitol just happened less than a week ago at the time of our recording. And after that, I've seen, probably 8-10 articles on Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. And so, again, it's a question. What is the relationship between church and state that we still struggle with?
Yes.
And Constantine at least gives us a window of somebody who I think doesn't necessarily see himself as using the church but does see the church as a useful tool, but also sees himself as a faithful adherent to the church. And so when I look at his response to this Arian controversy, I see a couple of different aspects kind of simultaneously happening for Constantine. And the first thing I would want to note is that he attempts to solve the conflict without a council first. He writes a letter to all the parties involved. And basically, the way I always think of it is I'm going to date myself here a little bit. In the movie, I guess Mars Attacks.
Oh, no.
Jack Nicholson character comes on, these little people, can't we all just get along? Or why can't we just all get along? I think Constantine kind of takes that tack a little bit in this letter. He's like, let's just agree to disagree. And just let's all play nice. And he doesn't seem to recognize, I think, like this is a actual serious dispute. I think he just thinks it's like, people are just weird, fix it and let's move on. I don't think he realizes it's such a major issue. I mean, when you're talking about, who is Jesus, it's a fairly good question for the church to have to answer.
Yes.
Who do we believe that Jesus is? And I think once he kind of gets the responses, and one of the interesting aspects is that in that day, the bishops kind of didn't have a problem telling the emperor to mind his own business. My son has the phrase, mind your own business, right? And they basically told him to, kind of shove off. We're going to fight this out, buddy. But Constantine, as the emperor, has a vested interest, right, in the unity of the people. And they were rioting in the streets on these questions. Today we tend to think like, theology is maybe not such a big issue anymore, but for them it was huge. It was definitive to who they are, and how they understand themselves and their relationship with God. Like they were, for them, oftentimes it wasn't a more important question. In fact, we have, as a funny side story, Gregor of Nazianzus, who is we call him one of the Cappadocian fathers. And he's the one who eventually kind of crafts a solution to this problem of, is Jesus fully God? Is he not? And if he is fully God, how do we talk about that? We call it the Trinity. He's the one who helps kind of craft the final solution to that. But he talks about where he's like, man, I go down to the fish market. I want to buy a fish. And the fishmonger is asking and telling me his viewpoint on the deity of Christ. And he's like, I just want a fish. But it tells us that, people from all walks of life are engaged in this, to the point where they feel so strongly about it, where they take to the streets. And so Constantine and most political leaders, have a vested interest in, rivalry and area to be peaceful. It's a good selling point to the people. And so, part of why I think Constantine, acts on it is, I want there to be peace here. But at the same time, I think we don't always give Constantine enough credit that he also recognizes that this is a real problem in the church and it needs to be solved. And that the only way to solve it is really to kind of get everybody in the same room and have them talk about it. So this is why I think both of those aspects, he's got, kind of political concerns, but also I think he at least sees himself and he wants to be a faithful member of the church. And he wants to kind of facilitate a way in which the church comes together. Now, at the Council of Nicaea is highly, highly disputed what exactly Constantine's role was. So he certainly calls the council and puts the bill for it, which, is kind of nice,
Absolutely.
Every once in a while I travel and the university pays for it, and I'm like, woo,
Right.
Not just McDonald's for me.
Right.
But they all arrive there. And then we get different accounts of kind of what actually happens and what Constantine's role is, where some believe that Constantine was overtly in charge of the council, that Constantine actually floats the theological term that the council uses is a Greek term, homoousios, which just simply means of one substance. So it says that Jesus is the same substance as the Father. So the idea that he's truly God. I always put it, whatever it is to be God, Jesus is in. Has it 100%. And so something that Constantine may have made that recommendation. Others think that his advisor, a guy named Hosius of Cordoba, kind of, like whispered in his ear, like, hey, why don't you try this one and see if you can try it? Others think that Constantine was just kind of there. But that the bishops themselves were the ones who kind of ran the council. So at that point, it's really kind of difficult to know historically what actually happened. And then after that, Constantine does take a little bit more of an active hand when it comes to leadership in the church. He'll start to view himself as kind of a bishop of bishops, view his role as emperor as ordained by God, and kind of start to take a little bit more active role in who's the bishop and what the decisions are. Eventually starts to see himself as being kind of the culmination of the apostolic tradition. So sees himself as kind of the final apostle, which is kind of, a dangerous ground to be on.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, but I always think it's hard to know how much of it he does because he believes it and how much of it is kind of for show.
Yeah. And that will probably always be disputed. One day we'll find out. It's funny sitting here. I need to be taking notes. The good news is I have all this recorded, so I can go back and listen to it at any point. This puts me right back into my sophomore year in the lecture halls at Olivet. Like this type of thing. The people who are listening, I bet they can't help but look at, and you touched on it a little bit, but see the modern parallels, the tension that we hold here in America, this idea, this Jefferson idea of separation of church and state, and this equal tension. When I look back over the church and I look at somebody like Constantine, he started out as a mediator, and then, like you had just mentioned, after Nicaea, starts to kind of cross into that territory a little bit. And it's a story I'm going to have you back on for with Ambrose and Theodosius, because that was my favorite story you ever told in that lesson. We don't have nearly enough time for that. That takes a whole podcast in and of itself. But when I look at like our country here, and usually at this point in time, after 200 and some odd years, usually the church either has been persecuted into almost oblivion, or it has become so lined with the government. It is this idea of Christian nationalism, where maybe its true form has been perverted and so much politicized that you can't separate the nation and the religion any longer. And at least in America, even though there's a marriage there, obviously, of certain groups, we are still in that tension. We haven't been overruled, and we also don't have the Protestant version of a pope sitting in the White House, and so it's interesting when our nation is like, we're not really following the trend of most nations at this point, but you're starting to see that fracture, which I think we can learn from church history. And I guess the question I have for you is, do you see those modern parallels today? And what would be your warning? What would be your encouragement to Christians today? Like, hey, go and learn from our history. Like, what would you encourage them to study?
One of the things that I think history bears out is that the church universal has to be, and local has to be, very cautious about what does the interaction with the state look like. And I think one of the things that history kind of shows to me is many times the church historically has tried to kind of take that shortcut that we talked about earlier, to kind of let the government do the work for you. And one of the things that I think is borne out is that comes at the price. That ultimately the concerns of the government and the concerns of the church are divergent. There are certainly lots of similar concerns, but the ultimate concern is, I think, very different between the two institutions. And that ultimately, I think what ends up happening is that the government wins. Not like in an eschatological sense or anything like that, but that in that historical sense, the government will always find a way because of the realms that it controls and the fact that we live in kind of the physical realm, that the government always finds a way to kind of come out on top. And that as the church kind of cedes its mission to the government, then ultimately what happens is that the church becomes a tool and then becomes used and then becomes used by the government. And we see it time and again in the church. And one of the things where there's that phrase, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find is a very kind of cautious and sobering thought. That in what ways has the modern church wanted to basically just that something like an institutional, or we sometimes use the phrase national Christianity or national religion, kind of do the work for us. And I think we see that in kind of all the different walks, where many who have grown up in the church leave, because it's been nothing more than just kind of a national identity. I'm born in America, so it's de facto I'm a Christian. And it creates what we call Christendom, where it's just kind of, and this goes all the way back to Constantine with Imperial Christianity that says kind of loyalty to the state is equal, or the same thing as loyalty to the church. And that creates the environment where the political leader is uniquely appointed by God. So oftentimes they would use messianic terms to talk about Constantine. He is an instrument of God. He's chosen by God to lead us into kind of the great new world. And what usually happens is that then don't question Constantine.
Yeah.
Whatever he does has to be, by virtue of the fact that we've kind of made him into a savior type of figure, has to be correct. And so oftentimes that ends up with his biographer Eusebius kind of glossing over some of the atrocities that Constantine commits. And I think in our own world that we find similar responses to our various political leaders. That if you are, a committed conservative, then it's very difficult to admit that Trump made mistakes. If you were a committed Democrat, it would have been very difficult to admit that President Obama had made mistakes. And it kind of, goes both ways.
Sure.
And a lot of that is because there starts to become this equation that the political leader becomes kind of this savior figure. And that's really an outgrowth of kind of that nationalism or Christendom, or even some argue that imperial theology, the idea that the emperor is God ordained to lead the church into better times.
Sure.
That's kind of where Genesis is.
Well, that makes complete sense, and you're not dismissing the possibility that God can use anyone at any time to do anything. However, I think this is a broader topic about who are we as Christians worshiping, who are we uplifting, or who are we holding accountable? Like if, for example, someone claims to be Christian, well, then I think our Holy Scripture, our text, talks about what we are supposed to do to them as fellow brothers, and what type of behavior, what type of fruit we are supposed to see from their lives. But also, if they are to fail, if they are to, be like every other person on the face of the planet and God forbid sin, does that affect my spiritual life? Does that affect the overall mission of the church? And it seems as if, as of late, the despondency I'm seeing in the church today is very much tied to other people's faith or acclaimed faith. It has nothing to do with what God is doing in me. It has nothing to do with this overall mission of the church. It's somehow I'm going to, abdicate my faith and basically project it on somebody else. When they fail, it's failing me because of this, like you said, this Christendom. And that is like one of the biggest parallels I see. Like the phrase of this podcast is not letting the state do the work. Like that is such oh my goodness. I don't know why you didn't say that in college. Maybe you did. I wasn't paying attention, but that is a great, great way of putting it.
Yeah, I think, and that's been, if you look back at, like, say, the thought of Soren Kierkegaard, the 19th century. Yeah, I think 19th century Danish philosopher. That's one of his big kind of thinking points. He's like, Christendom is actually the enemy of Christianity. That it's not about just living a good life. It's not just about following the rules of the country I live in. And for Kierkegaard, his thought was it has to, be messy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think that history teaches us, and I think he wanted me to at some point kind of touch on, kind of what does history kind of teach us?
Yeah.
That, errors are a part of our history. That nobody is ever going to be perfect in this life.
Yes.
Jesus has a corner on the market.
That's right.
There's a phrase on the office, nobody is perfect. Right? Like we are going to screw this up. We're going to. And one of the things that I find fascinating is there's oftentimes a reluctance to accept that. There's a desire to explain it away. And to a certain extent, I think that the actions that the church individuals have taken has to be contextualized, has to be understood within their culture, within the expectations of their world, all those sorts of things. It doesn't mean that we approve of what they've done, but it has to be rightly understood. And oftentimes, I think there's this rushes judgment on historical figures before an accurate understanding of what they thought, what they did, why they did it, what were the constraints that they were working under. There's oftentimes a rush to judgment about any of those things. But I think there's oftentimes a reluctance to admit that errors have happened, that people have done stupid things. And so there's the idea of we oftentimes have to erase those people and not admit the fact that there's ever anything good about them, or we have to defend it and say, no, it's fine. And I think history tells us like there's this middle ground that says, you know what? We can own the fact that people in our tradition have made horrible mistakes. But I can also own the fact that when I don't have to do that, and two, I can own the idea that I have to rightly understand why they did what they did, why they believed what they believed. And I think that that's kind of the tension that we live in. So, yeah, and that I think it reinforces the idea that there's nobody who's purely evil. There's nobody who's purely good, save Jesus. But that we can learn from them without having to necessarily say, we're going to do it that way. And I think that's one of the greatest advantages of learning about our history. Why do they do what they did? Do I want to do it the same way? Do I want to do something completely different? But before we abandon the tradition, say, at least let me know that I understand it.
Yeah.
Or before I follow it, let me at least make sure that I know what it's saying. And again, that creates a tension within the church. You'll have the tradition that's like, we got to do this way, we've always done it. And then destroying all this with that. Well, we started doing that in 1947. Before that, nobody did that, right? Or whatever. And then there's also the ones that want to say anything that's ever been done, we got to do completely differently. And we want to go. Historians want to say, well, let's go back and see why we're doing it like that. And if we want to change it, then let's make sure that we're responsible in the way that we change it.
This is such a fundamental point of it's not erasing history, and it's not uplifting it to a pedestal, and it comes back to this idea that yes, maybe theological, our heroes of old, there is a tendency to forget the worst parts and remember the good, and vice versa, depending on how history likes to view a particular person, and there's that abandonment of the middle ground, which I think is so hypocritical, because if we're to look back over our own lives to make it personal, we would see the middle ground, especially if you're a Christian and you're living every day in trying to pursue holiness. That's not like every day. It's a constant struggle to against your sin nature. There's a reminder there that there's a reason why I'm going to die in the first place. That sin has entered the world, and our prognosis of that is death. Obviously, Jesus steps in. From a theological perspective, I'm going to remain orthodox for this podcast, and we see this. If we look in the mirror and we try to hold ourselves to the same standard, there's going to be a lot of middle ground in our own lives. At what point in the past was I perfect? Or was there a time when I was in rebellion and I was experiencing a lot of shame, but Christ brought me out of that? So my past is no longer something that rules me. It's not all of the bad things that I see. I look at the grace of God when I look back on my past mistakes and where I am today. And I just don't understand why we don't hold ourselves either to the same standard, or we completely ignore it in our own lives. And that's something that I think for today, if people are really trying to cope with these failings of church leaders, or these contemplations of the men and women who've gone before us, and then we've discovered they weren't perfect. I always wonder if we could start looking at our own lives first and say, would we pass that historical test? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to be judged by their worst decisions. That doesn't define who you are. Just as in the same way, your best decisions don't define who you are. It's just all of them together.
Yeah.
And one of the issues I always have is that when we go back and only look at the ridiculous things that people have done, the stupid things, the horrible things that people have done, and we define them by that. And again, we wouldn't want to define us that way. But it also doesn't allow for any kind of sense of growth.
Yes.
That, if I look back and, had talked to 20-year-old Mark, man, he was an idiot. The things that he thought were true, open your eyes, dude. And some of the choices that he made, like, I would want to go back and just hit him upside the head. Like, what am I thinking? But at the same vein, that in part is what made me who I am today.
Sure.
And that, there's perhaps a great danger of not allowing growth to take place. So, you look back, and we live in an age where, kind of backwards-looking scope is very limited, and very damning. Whereas one thing that doesn't kind of measure up to what we think is the right thing, and we end somebody. So that we'll go back, and every once in a while you find, this is what somebody tweeted 20 years ago, or this was a post to put up on Facebook as a high schooler. Like, no 4-year-old should be judged for what they said in high school, because when their brain is still developing, they're still saying the same stuff. Yeah, okay. But if they're a person, we have to start to see some of that. And I think historically, like, if you look at historical figures, we have to see that as well. Yeah, they're growing, they're challenging times. Some of the things, like Ambrose, I love him, but man, he did some horrible things. Like there were some decisions where I'm like, what were you thinking when he decided to do that? And I can see what he was thinking. And I'm like, well, I just don't think he thought it through very well.
Right.
But at the same thing, I look at the other things that he did, and as he learned from what he had done. And again, some people don't, they don't change. And I think they're, kind of, history judges, that, you kept making the same mistakes. You're still the same racist today that you were,
You're right.
when you hadn't been introduced or exposed to these issues, to these understandings, that you didn't change and grow as you came to a better understanding. Like there, yeah, then you start to see the measure of the person. But the measure of the person, I think, always has to be, how do we see them growing and changing? That when they see, like, oh, when I did that to that person, that was wrong. And they go back and they apologize and they make restoration takes place. I think that's, sometimes this seems to be lacking a little bit in kind of, I think, in a social media driven world. And one of the advantages I think that historical people have is that, we can't go back for the most part and dredge up stuff that they were.
Sure.
We've always got, and that's it.
Yeah, we do. We have to hold ourselves. I mean, we have to do a lot more deleting if we were going to try to cover our basis a little bit more. I guess.
And I don't think we let folks necessarily off the hook, but
no,
that it's not that, and some things are often more damning than others. But that the idea, I think, is that growth has to be made possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that the environment has to be conducive to that. And I think that's a very Christian message. That and very Wesleyan message. that we should always be that the person I am today is not the person that I would be 10 years from now. That I need to be looking at my presuppositions. That I need to look at the language that I use, and be attentive to it. And constantly kind of examine myself. As a teacher, that's one of my goals, is to say, okay, how am I a better scholar today than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Oh, sure.
How am I a better teacher today than I was? And what are the pieces of me that needs to be changed? So, and sometimes that's the language that I use. One of the things that where I was brought up was, we use guys for everything. Any group of people was, hey, guy. Mm-hmm. And language has changed. That, guys is a masculine-oriented term that can be very exclusive of women. Mm-hmm. And man, 30 years I used that term as, as an all-inclusive term. Everybody kind of, got it. But now the language is shifted. It's a challenge to say, I have to say the way that I used to do things needs to be different. Mm-hmm. Because of the environment that I'm in. Now, what I wouldn't want is to go back and find a 30-year-old transcript where, guys listen to that and say, he was using gender exclusive terms and that kind of thing. What I want him to say is, okay, so he learned that, most now don't see that word that way, and he's excising it from his vocabulary. And I think that's one of the things that oftentimes history, even historians miss a little bit, that we don't necessarily see how does kind of the thought of somebody change as time goes.
Yeah.
That we want to treat oftentimes historical figures as monolithic entities. I mean, none of us would want to be treated that way.
No, absolutely not.
So, yeah.
Well,
that's one of the things that I think history can help us with, to get that realization that modernity can help, or the current context can help us as we think about how do we study history.
This is truly, like, I think some of the things that needs to be taught in Sunday school. It needs to be taught to people more so because of that perspective. I mean, Christianity has the most rich history on the planet, and it's a shame that it's not taught more. So for me, I'm doing my best to try to teach this and throw it into sermons without making people fall asleep. I don't have the gift that you do, but if I were to recommend some things to my congregation and the people listening, if they want to just start, if they don't even know, let's say we're starting out with an elementary understanding of church history, where should the average churchgoer like start when it comes to trying to understand maybe the present context by first studying the past? Like what type of books, what era would you go to? I mean, this is assuming they've read their Bible. So I guess I'm saying outside of the Bible and maybe commentaries on scripture, what type of figures, eras, and material would you encourage people to look at?
I think there are a couple of kind of formative eras that I would recommend they look at. One I would recommend just we call them a survey textbook, a survey book on the history of Christianity, to get kind of the breadth of the history of Christianity. Usually, Justo Gonzalez's The Story of Christianity is seen as a fairly good introduction to the topic, and told in a little bit more of a narrative format that doesn't kind of get lost in theological weeds. So that's one place to kind of start, is with a good, just kind of survey of the church. In terms of people to look at, if you really want to understand the theology of Western Christianity, I think you have to start with Augustine. There are others that you could start with earlier than Augustine, but Augustine is one of those other kind of towering figures that is just not the same after him. So he's one that kind of, I kind of always somewhat half-heartedly say, like, everybody after Augustine has to deal with the guy. You can't really do theology in the West without having to do it one way or another, deal with him. His Confessions is perhaps the most accessible of his works, with a good bit of theology tucked into it. It's the very famous story of his life, or at least his first 3 or 4 decades. The Reformation period is another very good one to look at if you're a Protestant.
Sure, yes.
So even if you're Roman Catholic, the Reformation period is good to look at for one, to understand kind of what the Protestants are thinking, why they established their own tradition apart from Roman Catholicism. But also, modern Roman Catholicism has started to grapple at a much more significant level with the critiques that the Protestants were engaged with. To the point where, I don't know, I had a friend, a Catholic priest. He was telling us about how they were singing the Mighty Fortress of Our God in the church that week. And, that's a very famous Lutheran hymn. So I think kind of the Reformation era is a good one to know more about, if you just simply want to understand what is it to be Protestant. If you're from a Wesleyan background, a survey of the life of Wesley is pretty useful as well.
Absolutely.
The Thought of Wesley. Ken Collins' book, The Scripture Way of Salvation, is a good one to start with. I think it's Mark Maddox has a number of books on Wesley as well that are usually pretty good. And Wesley is at something of a pivotal time in the history of the church, where kind of the church is grappling with enlightenment and kind of the transformation of human understanding away from kind of reliance upon revelation. God told us this, to reason. We thought this up ourselves. So, or it makes sense to us, kind of thing. And how do we? The mind is all about to make sense of stuff, and let's just do that. So that's a fairly impactful time. And Wesley is kind of riding the cusp of that a little bit, if you will. So those are some eras to kind of look at. In terms of kind of understanding the modern church, certainly the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. And also Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the founder of liberation theology, would be something good to look at. So particularly if you're looking at understanding the current Pope, Francis I, or if you're interested at all in folks like Oscar Romero, I see a lot of impact from liberation theology's theme in the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot based on the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. So I think that understanding him would be very useful for wanting to understand kind of the current context of American Christianity, as well as a work on evangelicalism. So there are a number of fascinating works on the evangelical movement. Mark Knoll used to be kind of one of the leading figures. I don't know what he is anymore. He's retired, I think, from Notre Dame. But evangelicalism itself, I think, is shifting a lot within the last decade. So off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody who's writing a scholarly approach to that.
Yeah,
I would definitely recommend some of those books.
Oh, excellent. Because I know for me, it's like if it's written in the last decade, I don't want to read it until the next decade. But I'm always defaulting to going back. I know some of the things that you recommended to me, along with some other professors from Olivet, which I've been going back to, is anything from like Jürgen Moltmann, Liberation Theology, The Crucified God. That is probably the most dense work. I mean, he rivals Augustine in some of his like really dense work. So if you really want to challenge, I would recommend that. And then it was finally a book that you encouraged me to pick up after a long period of time. I finally bought it. Was William Bennett's Story of Christianity's First 1,000 Years. It's tried by fire, Story of Christianity's First 1,000 Years. That book is amazing at giving just an overall approach to just the early church and how we survived and how we got to where we're at and setting the stage. It's just really long. It's actually, it looks really impressive on a bookshelf, and you actually can use it as a personal defense weapon. So it serves multiple needs.
One other ones to look at would probably be Bonhoeffer.
Oh, yes. Okay. Like Cost of Discipleship.
Particularly Cost of Discipleship. His idea of costly grace
versus cheap grace, right?
Versus cheap grace. And is, I think, even if folks today aren't necessarily referencing Bonhoeffer as much as they used to, which is hard to know kind of from decade to decade, but a lot of his ideas on religionless Christianity drives, I think, what's happening in a lot of the wings of Christianity today. But kind of all the different approaches to Christianity are trying to grapple with.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for all those recommendations. And thank you for being able to set aside time. I mean, we set aside time for an hour and you've given me an hour and a half. I mean, I feel so privileged, and I hope this is not the only time, because there is so much more to talk about. And so I'm going to have to reserve some time with you later this year, because I want to revisit some of these themes, as well as some other figures in the church that I think people would just get a kick out of. So Dr. Frisius, you continue to impact my life many years thereafter. And I promise you, even though I will still mix up some of the dates as I failed on those tests multiple times, my love for the history, God used you particularly to impact me, and He continues to do so. So thank you for our friendship, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening this week, and thank you so very much to Dr. Frisius for his time and his commitment to the academic world. If you enjoyed what you just heard, please leave us a review anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Simply search We Shall Not Sleep. If you ever have feedback, suggestions, or would like to ask us a question, you can email the show at wsnspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, and may God bless you and keep you.